were actually exposed in the office areas, not enclosed within the core, right?
There are indeed some core columns that aren't immediately adjacent.
Right, quite a few. Let's keep in mind that in the 1993...
They had access from the elevator
Richard, in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, that involved about 1,000 pounds of TNT equivalent in a truck bomb. Didn't destroy a single column. Richard is alleging that thousands of tons of steel was blown all over the site. There are no detonations. And here's my challenge to you, Richard. Let's take the Evan Fairbanks footage of Building 2 collapsing. The east side bows inward as the collapse begins.
Well, in fact, I've got that video. Let's look at it.
Richard, okay. let me get my challenge out. It's really important.
But it's also really important that we get at least one of the other points in, because there was one other presentation, 2-minute presentation he had to make. Okay. Richard, is that the beginning of that one?
Yes. In fact, the South Tower begins its collapse. And the big building falls at an angle approaching 22 degrees. And yet, as you look, which indicates that it would fall to the street in some mangled heap, right? But that's not what it does. It disappears and pulverizes into its individual structural members. Watch what happens, though, from underneath. Even though we have asymmetrical damage and asymmetrical collapse, what we have surrounding the building is explosions wrapping, like the first responders cited, 118 of them, in fact, citing sounds of explosions at the initiation of this collapse. Watch what happens as this building comes down. It's symmetrical and virtually at free fall speed. All of these columns are removed and hurled laterally at 70 to 100 miles an hour out of the building, some of them 200 miles an hour. How does that happen from a gravitational collapse induced by fire?
Here we go. You said that, and here's my challenge that I wanted to get out. We'll take the Evan Fairbanks footage, which is real close-up footage of the beginning of the South Tower collapse, where the wall bows inward. Richard, if you will point out to me where the detonations occurred preceding that inward bowing, I will quit my debunking activities. I will remove my website. I'll apologize to you and everyone else in the truth movement, and you will never hear from me again in this context. So that's all you need to do. And if you can't, and Richard, if you can't do that,
answer that question.
And Richard, if you can't do that, I would only ask that you put up on your website.
Question for you.
What you do is you take some thermite and you remove the core columns. That'll pull on the trusses and that'll pull on the exterior.
No, sir, Richard, because you claim that the witnesses heard these explosions before the collapse began.
They might not have heard before
the collapse, and then they heard the ones as the collapse.
This is not what you say in all of your presentations.
And I would say
it's not what you say in all of your presentations.
In contradistinction, you would also say, it has to be said that you've said the witnesses are not necessarily reliable.
Let me talk about these 118 witnesses, okay? This is a paper by a Buddhism scholar named Graham McQueen. He says that even though none of these people actually believe that explosives happened, someone sort of got to them and convinced them that the official story is true. 57 of these people didn't see one or both of the collapses. 38 didn't describe anything like an explosion coming from the towers. 29 of them clarified their statements in some way. 58 had no idea that what they were experiencing was the collapse of a tower. And here's something that Richard really doesn't want you to know. Of all the people who described seeing both of the collapses and used the term like an explosion or I thought it was a bomb going off, only 2 of them use a similar term for the other collapse. And when you read the accounts in context, that's perfectly clear because they had no idea what was happening with the first collapse. They weren't expecting it. So usually they would hear it, look up, see the building starting coming down, and they're running for their lives.
I encourage listeners.
Now, Richard, on your website and in your presentations, you say 118 people, first responders, also saw flashes. Guess how many the real number is out of the 503 accounts that those are taken from? The real number is 2, Richard. But what you did is you took those 2 accounts, you split them up into several accounts, and didn't identify them each time to pretend like more people said they saw flashes. 2 people said they saw flashes.
Let me respond.
I encourage the listeners, the viewers of this program, to go to Journal of 9/11 Studies and read the report themselves.
So do I.
It is
thoroughly convincing.
I encourage them to go to my site.
Let him finish. Let Richard finish.
You're going to be fair with
me, or we're not going to have a debate.
This makes me mad.
Many of these of the reporters, dozens of them, recording, feeling the explosions in their bodies, 1,700 feet down at the ground level, as these explosions were happening up above.
Name one.
Now, let's talk. Let me bring up the next subject. Otherwise, we'll just rehash the same type of of argument. Now, we're going to talk about how these buildings came down. I have with me 110. I have a 95-story building. I have two 15-story buildings that I'm going to drop. I'm holding them up. I'm going to drop them at the same time. This is going to show that we have what amounts as a virtual free fall speed, unimpeded, as I'm dropping the 15-story building over nothing at all on one side and over a 95-story building on the other. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh my God, the one that had no resistance under it falls at free fall speed. What happens over here? The one that has 80,000 tons of structural steel on it. It doesn't even give. It resists and is met by an equal and opposite reaction known as the conservation of momentum. It doesn't fall. You can see these technical papers on our website, ae911truth.org, and it is incredible. It shows that this
building should never have collapsed.
I'd like to address that real quickly. I can do
yes,
30
and
seconds.
just a real quick one statement of mine.